Hey guys, welcome to the channel in this video. Today is going to be a really great treat for you guys. We have Amy from Frugal Over 50. And before I introduce her, well, first off, of course, do all that fun stuff. Hit the like, answer or ask any questions here. Amanda might join us here in a bit, but she had a she double scheduled herself, and if you know anything about Amanda, that very rarely happens that she does that, but somehow she did that because of time zones, and anyway, Amy, speaking of time zones, lives all the way in Hawaii, and we're on Eastern time, so she's like, it's morning over there, afternoon and almost quitting time over here, or close to. So let me just read a little bio of who Amy is. She runs a YouTube channel, Frugal Over 50, where she shares tips and tools for frugal living. She started her channel in early 2019 as a hobby and to keep herself accountable. That's what I loved mainly. It was an accountability tool for her to grow in her financial goals that she had, and it kept her accountable.
Hello, Brandon. I have to confess that about a minute into your talking, I stopped being able to hear you, and I don't know if that's an issue on my end or yours, and I'm really sorry about that. If you're able to hear me, can you let me know?
Can you hear me now?
Oh, there you are. Fantastic.
I can hear you. Can you hear me now?
I can hear just fine. So.
Oh, you know what? I must have hit a. Anyway, you probably didn't even hear my bio of you.
I heard the first
or
part
I read
of it,
about,
and then
I don't know.
Yeah.
Hey, this is what happens when you go live.
That's right.
Things happen, technology. So thanks for joining. If you didn't hear me, Amy leads Frugal Over 50, the channel, and she is really awesome at that. She's been growing that to 6,000, I think, almost. And you started the channel mainly for accountability. If I don't know if you heard that part, but to be accountable to yourself, right? Is that right?
Yes, I started my channel in early 2019. I had been wanting to start a YouTube channel for a long time, and I was trying to decide between two topics. I was trying to decide whether I should follow what I do in my day job, which is teaching music, and specifically voice and choir and anything music related that surrounds voice, or if I should move into my other primary interest, which is frugal living. And it took a long time to decide. And I finally decided on frugal living because I needed the accountability. And I noticed that the channels that I watched where people were reporting on their budgets, for instance, they did better than I was doing. I was trying to keep track of my budget. But when I started going on every week to tell people how I was doing with my finances, and you can't see those old videos anymore because I've taken them off. I've shifted a little bit in how I do my recordings and stuff, but they're still there for me to see, like a diary. And I immediately did better in my finances because of that. So yeah, it was a hobby, but it held me accountable, and I did much better financially because I told people how I was doing.
I think that's huge to have that accountability and a virtual accountability with all these people from who knows where. Looks like we have Quintina. Hopefully she can hear me.
Hi, Quintina. I'm so glad to see you here. Oh
yeah, she is, and she can hear Amy, of course. Hopefully she can hear me.
Great.
And we also got Anna Regis. from Ohio. I don't know where Anna lives, but I'm in Ohio. And
Fantastic. Hi, Anna.
we have Kate Caden. She has a really big
Hey,
channel.
Kate. Hey, Kate. Kate's been my hero.
Yeah.
She helped my channel kick over to the first 1,000. Thank you so much, Kate.
Nice. Well, and like really, as we grow on our channel, we just started this whole thing. Well, I've had a channel for about 6 years or so, and it was a coffee shop thing. And
Right.
And I pulled some of the videos. My oldest video, if you look on it, is about, you know, our origin story of the coffee shop. And it was crazy when I pulled it back up. I was like, wow, this is weird.
Yeah.
But then we transitioned it, and I remember this is strange. Every year we do like an assessment of how the year went, and looking at the past, and then we look at the future. And one of our goals in 2013, I think it was to get stronger at YouTube. And apparently that did not happen in 2013, because otherwise I'd have a really big channel right now.
Right.
And I was looking at it, I was like, man, I wish I would have done that then. And I did not follow through, because I probably didn't have the accountability.
Yeah, I have the same sort of story in that I wanted to do something with this for a long time. I had really started examining my life from a frugal living perspective around the time I turned 50. So we're going close to 5 years ago. And it had been, you know, at that point, decades of living in a certain way in relationship to my money. And I was trying to change that. And so I was obsessed over all of these YouTube channels that were about that. I was like, I need to start my own channel. I need to start my own channel. And it wasn't until I could connect the accountability piece to what I wanted to talk about that it really came together. So for me, when I talk about YouTube, I'm really talking about my frugal living journey as much as anything. And I'm glad that you started there, because I know that's where we're headed, is to talk about money and frugal living and the money history. And it's all really tied together for me.
Well, and I do think, like, even when we do our channel, we've been learning a ton. Just as you teach others, a teacher, as you know, you're a teacher. You learn a lot when you might have it in your head, but when you have to communicate it out, it really gets placed in your heart a little better. Does that make sense? And I think that's even for me as a creator, and as Amanda does a lot of our videos, that whole teaching thing, it helps us as creators almost more than it helps the audience, I think.
Yeah, I don't disagree with you there. In my day job, I've been a teacher my whole career. And so it's often true that we learn it better when we teach it. And there's another aspect of it, particularly with relationship to what we do voluntarily. In other words, not something somebody hired me to do. I teach at a local university, and I teach what they want me to teach there.
Yeah.
But when I'm talking about frugal living on YouTube and on Instagram and any place else that I might do that, I'm really teaching the concepts that I find important. And when I dig down deep, I discover that these are concepts that I really need to learn. So I'm learning it by teaching it, and I'm teaching what I need to learn. And you had sent me a series of questions about my money journey that I think are very pertinent here. So I know you want to get into the meat of the interview, and I think this would be a great segue, because it's all sort of tied together for me. Brandon, I've lost you again, and I'm not sure why. I can see you, but I can't hear you.
Oh, well, keep telling me.
You're back.
What was your what was money like growing up for you?
When I grew up, it was very interesting. Sort of unusual for a lot of people. I grew up in a very religious family, and my parents were missionaries. And so one of the ways that we funded our life, we lived in Venezuela in the 1970s, and it was a great place to grow up. And one of the ways that we funded our life was for my parents to connect with congregations around the United States who would then offer monthly support. And if this sounds familiar, this is basically the Patreon or GoFundMe model.
Yeah.
It's sort of something that's come around again. Now, to raise a family like this in an international setting, when you are doing something that is not ever going to make a profit, is an interesting choice. And that's essentially how I spent most of my childhood, is with money being something that was very tied to the religious work that my parents did, and very much accountable to the people who were paying, who were sponsoring. So when we were in the United States, for instance, we would travel, whereas like now on Patreon, you can just put up a post for your patrons, right? But we had to travel all over the country when we were in the United States, visiting churches, and my parents telling them what they had done over the last 4 years or whatever since they'd been back. And so it was a very immediate and direct thing, where it's like, here's what we did. Can you give us some more money? And there was a sense of adventure in all of that. But there was also a sense of some precariousness, because this wasn't like, you know, a 20-something single person on an adventure. Oh, you know, support me on Patreon. It wasn't that. It was a family of 4 living their whole lives internationally on this model. So the first thing I would say about that is it did show me that that particular model of bringing in income and getting support for the life you want to live is certainly possible. It also showed me that it's really important to follow what people say about having multiple income streams. And in the end, my family switched out of that kind of a rule because it just became too precarious. If a church in the United States decided that they didn't like what my dad was doing in Venezuela, they could just stop paying. And that could be less food for our table. It was that direct. And, you know, they had kids to raise. So that's a difficult way to live unless you have a big, wide distribution of sources of income. So then my dad went to work for what he had trained for, which was as an engineer for an oil company. And that became a much more stable source of income. So what I grew up with was this sharp contrast between funding your life via a 1970s version of GoFundMe and this, super stable, oil company. You can't imagine a more stable job than an oil company in the 70s and 80s and 90s, right? And the sharp contrast between those two things has always stuck with me. And I have found myself mentally and psychologically and emotionally bouncing back and forth between those two, and finding it difficult to find, say, a balance between them, because I think they're both valid. But it's just, it was such a contrast of money influences growing up.
I think that, I don't know if you know this. I know you don't know this. So with our coffee shop, we have a lot of faith background with us. And we wanted to start a church, actually. My wife and I were going to be church planters and pastors. And we were like, all these churches, you're always asking for money and dependent on everyone for that whole model is like that. And we're like, well, what if you created a self-sustaining nonprofit that could help build on that? And so that was where the coffee shop came about, was this self-sustaining nonprofit idea to then support us. So we could grow in the other. The problem was a business is really hard to do, and building profit is a challenge, especially early years. But we couldn't even be a nonprofit coffee shop. That's what we wanted to be, and then kind of circle it back into that. And so we were kind of having that similar situation as you do within our own businesses, like 8 years ago, 10 years ago. So I can totally relate to that. And I'm glad I don't do that anymore. So how then your upbringing and money and this idea of frugality, and then you have a stable job now, it looks like you're kind of like, I'm sure when they were missionaries, it was a lot more frugal, right? I would
Yes.
think.
By necessity.
Yeah. And then on the flip side, when he worked for the oil company, I bet you it wasn't as frugal at that point.
It's interesting
Maybe.
because, you had some, in the questions that you sent me, you had some questions weaved in there about grandma, because of course your channel is Grandma's Wealth Wisdom.
Yep.
And both of my parents came from backgrounds that originated in farming and agriculture, or working. One of my grandpas worked for an oil company. This is in Oklahoma, so early 20th century, everybody worked for an oil company in Oklahoma. Nobody knows that anymore, but it was a big oil place. But it was very rural, very agricultural, and you were expected in that generation, in other words, the generation before my parents, you were expected to provide for your own needs from your own property. You had a huge garden, you had a farm, you fed yourself, you fed your family, you built what you had based on what you had around you. And so that the change between my grandparents' generation and my generation was really stark, and my parents lived through that. So they brought with them that sense of, we need to take care of ourselves from what we have, which wouldn't have been called frugal living. It was just how it was done. And then they brought that into the world that they lived in when they were sort of in their peak income years in the 60s, 70s, and 80s, those 3 decades, which was a time of huge economic growth in the United States. And so, we didn't live on farms. We didn't live off of the proceeds of a garden, that sort of thing. But at the same time, it didn't really matter what kind of job my dad had or what my mom was doing. It was all about, what do we have that we can use right now? There was very little emphasis on extra. And in fact, one of the difficulties that my parents had was that my mother wanted to reach out for more extra material things, and my father didn't. And that was a source of conflict. It's just interesting, that generational thing of, there was no, like, if you had asked my grandmothers, either of my grandmothers, about being frugal, they probably would have just stared and blinked. They didn't even, it wouldn't have occurred to them that this was a concept. It was just, in retrospect, when we look at their style of living, that's what we call it, because it's so different from how we were brought up. It was just, you have what you have, and you take care of it, and you keep using it. And then you give it to somebody else when you're done with it. That was it. There's not even a word for it. It's like having a word for air while you're breathing it, And then in my parents' generation, so many things shifted, and they had to really start thinking about aspects of money that their parents had not. And so for my dad, that all went into savings. And for my mom, it was like, I want some nice clothes. Let's do the fun stuff. And that was a tough conflict. So, the message from the grandparents filtered through the parents. It became a bit mixed.
Yeah. I think, again, this is why we called our channel Grandma's Wealth Wisdom. And knowing, like, for us, the reason we looked at that and thought about that was, frugality was just what you did, right? You had a farm, you bought a house, and you stayed in that house for 30 years. You had a car, and that was the car you had for most of the time. And I think that we lost some of that. And then, they had their pension, they saved, right? They saved versus invest. There's a very different thing between saving and investing.
I think you're hitting on something here when you use the word pension. If we look at the big shift in how people thought about their future from our grandparents to our parents to us, and I think I'm a little bit older than you are, but we'll include all of us in the same sort of adult generation right now. The grandparents, they didn't expect, at least for the men, to live past 65.
Yep.
And the Social Security was expected to pay for their wives and children after they died, because
Social
life was
Security
hard for them.
was expected it may be for 3 years. That was the point.
Yeah, there was just no expectation that it would take, people 30 years of retirement, which is now happening, a couple of generations later. And so there was that expectation of a possibly shorter lifespan.
Mm-hmm.
There was an expectation that Social Security would be a significant part of your retirement income if you had retirement to live to. And then even into our parents' generation, there was the expectation that if you give your time and your money and your expertise to a company or an institution of some kind, an educational institution, a state government, federal government, whatever it is, and you've been there for a long time, you work there for 30 years, you get your gold watch and you get your pension, right? And it was just part of the contract of people's work. Now, when I graduated from college in 1989, the first thing anybody told me about my money was, you better not count on Social Security existing by the time you retire. That has turned out to be an exaggeration, and I'm glad that it has, because I am one of these folks who actually likes to consider Social Security as a part of my future retirement prospects. It's not going to be my sole source of income, but I do like to consider it in there. And there's a calculation you can use depending on your age now and your age at the time of retirement to predict about how much is going to be there for you. And the amount shrinks, but it doesn't go away during my lifetime. So I'm glad about that. And the other thing is that pensions absolutely dried up and were replaced by this commercial financial product called a 401k. Now, I happen to work for a state government teaching at a local institution of higher education, local university. And so I do have a pension. I'm so grateful for that, because see above, under my rather strange background going back and forth between the GoFundMe style of living and the steady job style of living. And I'm glad that I invested in that pension. I'm really glad. But that's a huge change. And I think that when our grandparents, and at least when my grandparents were thinking about money, they weren't thinking about having to fund their own future out of their own investments, for instance. That wouldn't have been a conversation I would have ever had with my grandmother. Saving wouldn't have been something that would have been considered as, say, a long-term project, and it would have just been a daily habit.
It's a habit.
Conversations with my grandmother about my financial situation, if I could bring her back and talk to her, she would be confused and probably shocked and possibly appalled at the kind of commercialization of our future plans, our retirement plans that has happened over the last 50 years or so. There's not much that we can do about it except to go with it, make the best of it, and do the best that we can with our finances. And frugal living is a big part of that. So my channel is a big part of that. So that's where I am right now.
Well, and the founder of the 401k is Ted Benna, and he said that it was something he wished he didn't create, actually. And actually,
I would imagine that he did not expect that it would become what it became. I would imagine expected it to be a substitution rather than a replacement.
That was exactly what he was hoping, and it was just to add on as a benefit with a big. I think it was Johnson & Johnson was the company. I'm pretty sure one of those big ones. But then it pretty much big companies said, "Oh, I can take the risk from us and put it on the employee." And the problem is most employees, aren't very, when it comes to finances and saving. And at the same time, we became producer or consumers as opposed to producers.
Right.
And I think that changed things because we spend a lot more, and a lot of people are like, hey, this necessity of a smartphone is now a necessity versus a want, all this crazy. Yeah, exactly. And I think that, again, we have to think through and looking at the greatest generation and frugality. I mean, like cooking at home. Why is that a novel concept And,
Right. And I think that there are a number of sociological reasons why these changes happen that that sit alongside
mhm.
the idea of, capitalism just coming and taking over and saying, great, we'll put all the risk on the individual and then we won't give them a steady career. This will be fantastic for everyone. No, it's hard to draw really broad strokes and get a clear picture, because one of the things that I noticed in my channel, for instance, if you go to Frugal Over 50 and you look at the videos that I have that have done really well for me, they are really about habits and tips and tools for frugal living, essentials, things that are just basic. And these often have to do with, as you pointed out just now, the balance between producing and consuming. And I don't say that because that's a philosophical stance, and nobody goes to YouTube to say, what is your philosophical stance on frugal living? Nobody types that into a search bar. But they are curious about how to stop spending so much money at the grocery store. And the reason people are curious about how to stop spending so much money at the grocery store is because their mindset is shifting from whatever it was before they typed that into their search bar, right? Their mindset is shifting to, I need to do something a little bit different. Mm-hmm. What is it? And people may not even be asking questions that they can ask fully. They can't formulate them exactly. And so when we give people practical tips, often those tips still are about consumption, how to consume less, for instance, or how to use what you have, how to consume what you have appropriately for your financial situation. Because it is absolutely true that most of us are not producers, at least not in the way my grandparents were producers. That is just not my reality. My grandmother would look around my yard and say, you should have a huge garden. What is the matter with you? I don't have a huge garden. And this comes back to some of the sociological reasons for this. We moved away from being an agrarian society and into being an urban society. Fine, that just happened. That's not a moral statement of anything. It's just what happened sociologically. And then my four mothers and four aunties came out in the 70s and said, we are tired of doing unpaid labor in the house for the last 1,000 years. We want some money too. And so women went out to work, and then you start seeing things like frozen foods and convenience foods, which often get sort of piled on in this day and age when we're all trying to be more attuned to cooking at home. And I think especially in the pandemic, a lot of people want to know about how to cook at home. I learned how to make sourdough, for goodness sakes. But if we look at where these things come from, they often come from people going, hang on, if my husband's job is suddenly not stable, or if I just am not going to put up with a marriage that I can't stand because this is not working, I need to be able to take care of myself. I need to be able to take care of my children. I need to get out and work. Well, if I'm working, the partner's working, the kids are in school, who's making dinner? Right? So we become producers in a different way. And I think that one of the things that we deal with, you probably deal with in your business, and I deal with on Frugal Over 50, is how to handle our money, because we are, in some ways, we are primarily producers of money, if we think about it that way, because we're working to produce. In my case, I'm producing some intellectual property, for instance. I'm helping educate the next generation of college students. And in my side hustle here on YouTube, I'm helping to provide inspiration and cheerleading and support and detailed information and hopefully some education about how to live frugally, right? But that's all intellectual property. I'm not selling you anything. At the same time, I am bringing in money. I am not going out to my garden and bringing in blackberries, which I'm going to serve for dinner. I'm bringing in money off of my YouTube channel so I can go buy the blackberries to serve for dinner. And it's a completely different mindset. We're just working very differently. I don't know if that's 100% good or 100% bad, but it does seem to be where we are.
Oh, I think you're absolutely correct. And that's why, again, our crazy position that we're in our channel, right? Grandma's Wealth Wisdom is one aspect. And then Amanda started Financially Independent Female Entrepreneur. And the reason that we started that whole thing is financially independent. We should all strive for that. But the problem is with independence, you're always interdependent on other people.
Right.
You'll never have independence, actually,
Yes.
because of the society we're in. So it's hard to make a video about, hey, you'll never reach independence because we live in the world. I mean, it's true. Like, COVID can happen, and
I think that's a really good point. And if I could put in a little parenthesis here, I think it's a really good point. I think that a lot of times when women, especially when we hear things like financial independence, we get a little bit concerned because not all of us have the interest or even ability to leave our family obligations or our family commitments or the things that we want to do for family, for our friends, for community. Many women have been raised to always be looking around and saying, what do you need? What can I do for you? And while that's a socialized thing for women, for my generation especially, it's not necessarily something we want to get away from. I happen to like that I was brought up that way.
Yeah.
And I want to keep doing it. But if I'm looking at financial independence and I see that word independence, you're right, it might put me off.
Yeah.
Whereas if we think, no, this is a way to grow my own financial cushion so that I can contribute to the interdependence of my community, that's great. And I think we have shown over the past almost year now, it's a long time, it feels like 10 years, that we really are interdependent. We really need each other, and we miss each other when we can't get together as humans. So, Sorry, I took off and ran with that, and I know you had more to say. Back to you.
Well, have you ever read the book Sacred Economics?
I have not.
It's a really, really good book about the theory of money and the interconnection of, economics. Economics plays a whole role of all of this. And again, we can talk about, and I misspelled on here. I'm going to edit it right now. I just noticed. See, look at this. Real time.
So I'm not wearing my glasses. Everything looks fine to me.
So I did make sure I capitalized the O and the F.
Thank you.
But I missed the R in the front. So where was I at? So this idea of sacred economics and knowing like the interdependence culture, the sharing society where we would share, hey, I have too many bananas. I'm going to go give my neighbor, like my neighbors just gave us a whole bunch of pizza yesterday because they didn't want it. I was like, I don't really, whatever. Great. It's good because we know our neighbors. We're friends, which is, I think, lost a lot of times. We don't even know the people next door to us. So you've mentioned some of the entrepreneurship, and I want to share. There's a story that my grandmother, my grandpa. So my grandmother was a stay-at-home mom, right, and stay-at-home person because she took care of me too. I lived with my grandmother for a long time, and my grandmother wanted a new living room set, and he's like, "Well, we don't have the money. You had to come up with it," and so she came up with it. And so she was a sewer and crafts person. So she sold enough until she could buy the living room set. Now, for me, there was no word for entrepreneurship. There was no word for frugal. But yet, I'm like, well, apparently they were frugal and they were entrepreneurs. And sustainability, we love the idea of sustainability. But that's what they did. And I look at where did they come from? They came out of the Great Depression. And we are now in a really interesting situation now that maybe, again, why we said, well, maybe we need to look back. And sometimes wisdom skips a generation and look back and say, okay, they were savers, not investors. It's
interesting, yeah. The financial world was very different when they were when our grandparents were young adults. Yeah.
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 They put into whole life insurance, and it was like a thing that they did, right? Because that was a thing that they kept, or they had money under the mattress, right? So my father-in-law, my wife is young, but her dad was 87 when he passed. So he is from that generation. So she kind of got a baby boomer parent and the greatest generation parent all in one, which made it probably really interesting for her. But what do you think they would say about entrepreneurship? And as you're moving into entrepreneurship and combining, because I think that frugality is one thing, shrinking, but also we need to think about creating income, because our jobs can be gone. We need a side hustle.
Right. Yeah. This is an interesting question. I was reading this and thinking about what would my grandparents say about some of these words that we use and what they mean. And I agree with you that they would not have identified many of the things that they did in order to make a little money as side hustles or entrepreneurship or any of these kinds of things that we think of as building a business or building a sense of stability that goes along with what you do in your day job. It would just have been how you operate. You share what you have, you sell what you can. These kinds of things were just part of my grandparents' culture. And at the same time, I know that the particular religious background that my grandparents gave to my parents was one where they really got confused. There was a thing where people, instead of saying that the love of money is the root of all evil, which means if you're just greedy and that's all you care about, then that's kind of evil. Care about people too. And they would get confused and think that money itself is the root of all evil. And so one of the things that has been a challenge for me, I have to say, coming from not just my grandparents' generation, but also the parents' generation, and the whole background of the way that I grew up, was really having difficulty understanding the difference between greed and just doing any kind of crazy psychotic thing to get more money and not caring about people.
Yeah.
And understanding that money can be a tool for good, and money itself is just neutral. It's just a way to get stuff that you need or do things that you need to do. And I think that if I were to have a conversation like this with my grandparents, that it would be difficult. I think it would be difficult because there was just a real sense of almost fear about money, that if you put too much emphasis on it, you might end up burning in the fires of hell, that kind of thing. And I'm doing that with a sort of a facetious expression and tone, but those were real beliefs that they had. And so there was a real genuine physical fear about the accumulation of money and about being happy about having money. If you have it, that's okay as long as you're not happy about it. If you don't have it, even better. So the idea of looking at our modern society where money is a tool that we use to obtain pretty much everything. I don't have a garden. I'm not going out to get the blackberries in my garden. I have to go to the store and buy them. For that, guess what I need? I need money. And one of the things that has really sort of flipped a switch for me, I have to say very recently, as in the last few months, is that I started participating as a student in a course that's ongoing called Video Ranking Academy. And this might not seem the logical place to get this wonderful news about money not being horrible and evil. But Sean Cannell, the guy who runs it, was talking in one of the trainings, which is ostensibly about how to do better on YouTube. And thank you, Sean, because, wow, my channel has really taken off thanks to the things that I learned from them. But one of the things he said is, you need to know what your mission is in life. What is your purpose? And then you need money for the mission. Now, because I grew up as a daughter of missionaries, that kind of language is familiar to me, although it's been a long time since I've been participating in any of that. But that language is sort of baked into my DNA almost. So when I heard Sean Cannell say, you need money for the mission, it got me to thinking about what's the point of my life? What's my purpose? What am I doing here? And yeah, money could be really useful.
Yeah.
Now, this would be a difficult, possibly an impossible conversation to have with my grandparents. I would have to shape it very carefully, and there would be a lot of fear around it. And that's fear that I brought almost into my mid-50s myself. So some of the things that we are praising about our grandparents' generation are great. There's things that we need to bring forward. But I think it's also important that we recognize where their perspective worked for them, but won't work now. Because we're so many decades later, and the way that our society operates is so different. And that, for me, is a big one. Just recognizing that it's okay, Amy, to have money. It's okay. You're not going to turn into a psycho nut job just because you have money. You're not going to burn in hell just because you have money. It's okay. You don't have to, it's just, there's so many weird things that I have heard. There are people called financial therapists that can help you work through some of these things. And I'm like, if I ever live in a place that has one of these kind of people that I can get to, I'm going to go for some financial therapy. Because again, there are these things that I learned just almost baked into my DNA that I'm having to figure out and reconfigure in my mid-50s, not because they were wrong for my grandparents, although I sort of hate that they were afraid that they were going to physically burn in hell. That's something I wish that they didn't have to worry about, because they had hard lives. And I wish that they didn't worry about things like that. But all of that was tied up in their belief about money and how they lived their lives. And so where things were based on the confidence that they could produce enough to feed their families, I want to bring that forward. I absolutely do. Whether it's, I made enough money off my YouTube channel to afford the blackberries this week, great. Or whether it's, that worked really well for grandma, what's the thing that's going to work well for me here? And for me, it's, you need money for the mission. So I am so grateful to Sean Cannell for saying that. You need money for the mission.
When he came back, he came from a religious background too, from what I understand. So
yes, and also he's been very open about the fact that he was raised by a single mom, lived in a basement. You know, lots of mom working really hard to provide, and just that sense of combining a belief that all things are possible with the reality that you got to work really hard to get there. And so that, to me, gives a little bit more heft when somebody comes from that background, says that you need money for the mission, as opposed to if they grew up, you know, one of the richest people in the world.
Yeah. Well, and
I'm less likely to listen to them.
I think the challenging thing, and this is our worldview now, is we like to put people in boxes. And I think that we have a video we posted a while back, and what's the opposite of poverty? And no, there's no opposite of poverty, but maybe the opposite is enough, living with enough. And the challenging thing is, what is enough? Our world is, well, you know, once you get this, you need to keep going for this, and our lifestyle increases, and we need 50 houses and whatever. But having enough. Now, if you go with the enough thing long enough, people will call you a socialist, because you're like, if everybody had enough, we'd be great. And I'm like, no, I'm not saying that. And I think that all of these isms can be really bad when we just pull into capitalism in itself. It's just pure capitalist greed, and, you know, other things may be a bad thing. You know, but there's still some really redemptive qualities for that. Same on the other side. And the greatest generation had their great positives and some downsides.
And again, this is all context appropriate, because I would not, what I'm saying to you so directly, if I were having a conversation with my grandparents, I wouldn't say that directly, because it's not appropriate. It would be disrespectful, for one thing, to speak to my grandparents that way. But for another, they lived their lives in their generation.
Yep.
And they had to deal with enormous change. We think we've dealt with enormous change. No. My grandmother, my dad's mom, was born in 1912. 1912? No, 1899. She was born in 1899. She lived from horse and buggy to man on the moon in her lifetime.
Yeah.
I cannot even imagine that rate of change. And to navigate that in whatever way she did, good on her, right? So I would say, yes, I absolutely agree that there are things that those earlier generations had in our families that we can't bring forward. That doesn't necessarily mean they're bad. I might wish that my grandparents didn't do this, that, or the other, but what choices did they have in front of them? You know? Similarly, if they were looking at me, I've said over and over, my grandmother would be like, why don't you have a huge garden? What's the matter with you? Well, I don't have those choices available to me. If I run a huge garden, it won't feed my family enough to pay my mortgage. You know what I mean? There's all these differences there. So yeah, there's no hard lines. And I personally, if you watch my channel enough, you'll probably get a flavor of how my sense of economics and politics leans in the direction of socialism. I really want everybody to have enough. It's my inner kindergarten teacher. Let's all share. But you're right that there is no one way to look at everything. It's a prism, not prism, prism, where how you shine the light dictates what the colors come out.
Yeah.
And we live in what we live in. So it's like we're living inside the fishbowl. We can't see from the outside. We think we can when we look back at our grandparents' generation. But even there, we're not getting the full picture because exactly. Filtered through history. This is such an interesting thing. And it's not the kind of philosophical, mindset-based discussion that you can necessarily have when you're doing a tips and tools channel like I do. But I try to sneak these thoughts in just because when people are hurting about their money, they're hurting about their lives.
Yeah.
And I know this because I have lived it and I'm living it right now. My job may come to an end at some point in the next year or two, just because I work for a small state university and we don't have a lot of money these days. Yeah. It's terrifying. It's exhausting.
I think that's the challenge, right? We have the frugality side and things that we need. And then it's again, I mean, I ran a business, so I'm all for making money in my business, but also what does that mean?
Right.
And so I'm also on the entrepreneur side, and okay, why am I doing this? And at the same time, you can be driving, building an empire in your business, and you forgot about your family.
Right.
And I'm like, well, that's not
good either.
So how do you balance those two things? And that was been the hard part of our channel, right? Saying we're entrepreneurs. I like frugality. And I think we do financial services. I have my mother-in-law's car that has duct tape on the glove box because it works.
Yay!
I'm like, we could buy one.
It's fine.
Yeah, it's fine. When it breaks, and then we'll get a new one.
Exactly.
And even now, we just bought windows for our house. Yesterday, they put in $10,000 for windows. It's expensive. But I was like, well, I guess I'm not going to be doing this for 30 or 40 years. Probably 30, I guess. I don't know how windows last, but it just is thinking long range. And as this is just Amanda and I's arguments, as we were needing the windows, I still want, because we just lived in this place. We moved here March 13th, we moved in. And I want couches, really want a new couch. And my wife like, not until the windows are done. I'm like, yeah, but it's taken 3 months for them. We could go get a couch. And she's like, no, we'll wait. And in our relationship, we're kind of like, yeah, I know. We should wait and be frugal on that, or not frugal, but just timing. And at the same time, we will have those things. It's just timing.
Right.
Does that make sense?
Yeah. And this is where that producer consumer thing really hits for us in our generation and in this day and age.
Yeah.
Because you will, in time, produce enough income in order to get the things that you need. And you'll do it in the order that really works for you based on the income that you get and the priorities that you set. So, for instance, on my channel, when I'm talking about certain tips and tools and things that you can do, habits that you can do, there may be small choices that somebody can make. And that's a fairly small choice. A sofa right now or a sofa in 3 months. It's significant because a sofa is a piece of furniture. It's a little bigger decision than a cup of coffee. but it's something that when you make those little choices, we don't realize it, but we are shifting our mindset and we're giving ourselves power over this sort of feeling that we have to just go buy, constantly buy. Because we live in a world of advertising. And of course, you and I are advertising right now as we're doing this. So we're both advertising for our channels and our businesses, right? That just happens. We are always promoting what we want to introduce to people, what we want to share, what we want to sell. I don't have as much of a problem with that as some people do, but I do think that we need to understand what it is that it means when we make a choice, and if we can make small choices. And I keep saying small. I don't actually think that a sofa is a small choice. It's a big one. But in the grand scheme of things, I mean, you bought the house, you bought the windows. Those are huge. And then you're going to get the sofa. And then the question is not whether, but when. And this is such an important little mindset shift of we can have the conversation. And it sounds like you had a conversation, but not a fight, which is amazing and fantastic and wonderful. And go, the two of you, for that. Fantastic, brilliant, A+++. That's my teacher self giving you extra credit. And you were able to kind of consider carefully, when is it going to work best financially for us to do this? So then you're using the proceeds of your income in a way that really works for you. So then even as consumers of the sofa or the couch or the divan, whatever you call it, you are understanding it. Every time you sit on that sofa now, you're going to say, yep, we did that. We did it when we needed to, when we wanted to, when it worked for us financially. And then, you're consuming in the sense that you're using that sofa, but it's exactly the right choice at the right time. And I think that a lot of us get concerned and worried and harried a bit about these choices, rather than thinking, no, if I can wait, it's empowering. If I decide to do it now because I have a good reason, that's empowering. And so then it's just as empowering. My grandma wouldn't agree with this, but it's just as empowering as having that garden where I go out and pick the blackberries. And I've made that choice myself, and I've made that income to support that choice.
I think the challenging part for what, again, the consumer thing is saying, well, you deserve that sofa right now. So here's the credit card, go buy it. And that's what the situation is. We think we deserve certain things when, it's good timing. And then you actually value it more when you do the purchase. And I do think we are producers, we are consumers. Marketing is happening every day.
Exactly.
And how then knowing you're going in, or I have blinders.
Decide. Oh gosh, that is such a big thing. Yeah, that is such a big thing, because there's that message, and when I talk to people on my channel, Frugal Over 50, I'm often aimed at women my age or older, but I'm surprised at how many people are not women who come in, and how many people are younger, how many people are much older. And everybody has this sort of shared thing of that. We've all had that experience of having that feeling of, well, I deserve it. I deserve that thing. It's an indulgence that I should have. It's a luxury I get to have. And I'm left out if I don't have that. And I think that for most of the situations where we are struggling with those decisions, we have to separate out in our minds the consumer purchase decision
Yep.
from what do I actually need? And sometimes the two are the same and sometimes they're different. In your case, like using the sofa as an example, yeah, you need the new sofa.
Yeah.
So then the question is just one of timing, as you say. There are also a lot of situations that we face where the question is a little different. The question may be, what do I actually need? And the answer may lie somewhere way outside of a purchasing decision. And I'm thinking of something that where women are often targeted for expensive makeup palettes, for instance, $50, $60, $100 for makeup, or chocolate. Now, I got nothing against makeup, and I absolutely love me some chocolate. So this is not, I have no problem with either of these things. But they're both luxury items.
Yep.
There is no circumstance in which these items are not a luxury, unless you're buying makeup for the stage. You have to have your own makeup kit to get the job, right?
Yeah. Yep.
Or something related to that. So if I feel that tug and I feel that pull towards that thing, for me, it's usually the chocolate. I can resist makeup. I like to buy makeup, but it's cheap. It's the chocolate. I want the chocolate. Oh, you deserve that. Really? Why is this the message? I have to go back and ask that in sort of my cynical Gen Xer mindset. Why is this the message you're sending to me? Why? How do you know me that you think this is what I deserve? Maybe I deserve something different. And that's the facetious response. The other thing is, what if I really feel down and I feel sad and an advertisement comes to me saying, you have this chocolate, you'll feel better? Well, will that really make me feel better? Or do I need to go pat my dog and get a hug from somebody? Or maybe I need to clean the house. Or maybe I need to drink water because I didn't have any water all day. I've just been drinking coffee. Or maybe I need a nap. Or maybe I need to actually go back to therapy because I got some big stuff to deal with. You see what I mean?
Oh, yeah.
There are any number of things that we could need other than that thing that's being sold or marketed to us as an indulgence or as a luxury. And I think that particularly for women, I like to talk to us about that because we tend to be all right about the stuff like new sofas, right? Like, yeah, I can wait on that. But when the small indulgences come along and we just dribble out $5 at a time, $10 at a time, I had one point in my life where I was spending over $200 at a certain national coffee shop, which I still love. But my gosh, I could have done something a whole lot better with that $200. And I probably could have used a little more therapy. So this is a big sort of rambling answer to what you're talking about here. But advertising will always be with us, and it's so important that we separate out in our minds. Do I need that thing, or do I need something else? And this advertisement just sort of reminded me that I have a need.
Yeah.
You know, that's a really important distinction, and it's tough. Advertisers would rather we not make that distinction.
Well, my wife, she always says, do you need it or do you want it? All the time. So much so that we were like, oh, okay, I know what she's going to say. Every time she says it.
That's an interesting one, too, because I was reading about this. The World Health Organization has set up some real basic criteria for what counts as, you know, basic human needs.
Yeah.
And just to sustain life from now until the next day. So we're talking about, you know, people who are really on the edge of immediate death. And it's food, clothing, and shelter, and water is included in there.
Yeah.
And once you get past that, then you start thinking about the future, and then you start thinking about the shelter being more permanent, and you start thinking about food sources, and then you start thinking, and then you start, that's when you start getting into the kinds of gray areas. But I think that we do need to take ourselves seriously. And when, you know, for example, back in March, when everyone was hoarding toilet paper, for instance, I don't know why toilet paper was the thing, but when we do those kinds of behaviors, there is also an element of, I have to take care of my basic survival needs. So yeah, there's a timing issue, and yeah, there's a, do I really need this or do I need something else instead issue. And then there's also a, just, you know, a visceral fear of, I could die. I need to take care of my survival needs, and we don't always know how to do that. So This has gotten heavy.
Maslow's hierarchy of needs.
Right. Yes. Yeah. And that hierarchy of needs from Maslow, right,
Yeah.
goes way into self-actualization and self-realization. And we are the fortunate ones because we're doing that right here, right now. There are billions of people on the planet who are really trying to figure out the food, clothing, and shelter piece without a lot of help. So we have a big planet full of a lot of people. And it would be really interesting, not just to have this conversation with, in our minds and our memories with our grandparents, but talk to people around the world and their grandparents, get the different cultural aspects and from different financial backgrounds, different forms of government, different economies. How do people see these things?
I think like if we actually saw the person of everything that we buy, who created that, we would do a lot different. And so
I think so. I think we would, for one thing, I think we'd be more grateful.
Yeah. And I think that honestly, we need to like look and say, it is not a thing that I just bought, my shirt at Walmart or whatever.
Yeah. Like this right here, somebody sewed that seam.
Yeah, somebody did something.
Somebody sewed this. Somebody put this zipper on my jacket. Yeah.
And
really interesting,
if we actually saw the people behind everything that we did, or in our world, we tend to say, I owe this, and everybody owes me this. But we'll get them for cheap. And I'm like, well, if you thought about your money from a justice lens on everything, your money habits would change. If you saw the people, the things, everything that went into it.
Oh, that's brilliant. Yeah.
It's hard to do. Because again, we started a coffee shop, and this coffee shop was all about ethical economics and community building. And the reason was because we knew that coffee, second most widely traded commodity in the world, yet poor countries, and from Africa and South America. When you think about those places, you think poverty. But that's where our biggest agricultural thing of coffee and chocolate, they come from those cultures. And you're like, interesting that we buy this, yet somebody made the cocoa.
Right.
And it's probably really good, especially if it's usually, I think African chocolate's really good. If you guys have any questions, now's your chance.
I'm just realizing we've been going on for a while. Put my glasses on. Oh my gosh, we've been going for an hour.
Yeah, we got to wrap it up.
I'm keeping my glasses off so I don't have the glare. But if anybody has questions, I'd love to hear them. And I know people probably have to go off and do other things with their Saturdays too. This has been awesome.
Yeah. So thanks for joining us. I know this been a lot of fun for me.
Great.
And again, this is part of what I like doing is having guests on, especially I loved your channel and the Frugal thing. And I'm a male. I'm not over 50 yet, but I will get.
Everybody is welcome. And I have that in my about page. Everyone's welcome here.
Well, and I think, again, there's value in that. And it's about combining frugality and not just a mindset of poverty, because I think sometimes frugality and poverty can be, they're like, oh yeah, you're frugal because you're poor. I'm like, well, no, that's not what, you can have a prosperity mindset and be frugal. I think that's actually a good steward, in my opinion. So
for the mission.
Yeah. So I think balancing those two things or multiple things and knowing that we're complex. We are individuals that are, there's a lot going on in our heads there. So if somebody did a comment here. Bye everyone is what Anna Regis says. Do you know where she's from? I think she has a nice
I do not know, but I'm so glad to hear.
So thanks for joining us. Please hit that like button, all the things, subscribe. We want to grow this channel as well. I want to grow it to 1,000 subscribers hopefully one day.
For it.
So subscribe to the channel. You will learn a lot from Amanda and maybe me sometimes. But
Brendan, this has been so much fun, and I am so honored to have been here. So I also urge people to subscribe to this channel and hop on over to mine as well.
Cool. All right. Well, you guys have a great day, and we will talk to you soon.
Thanks a lot.